we are. Bryce or Amy? Yes, Amy's shaking her head. Yes. So today, as you know, we've been working on our zoning atlas project, and today we're focusing on zoning and transportation. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Annette to walk us through some of the introductory slides, and then Bryce and Toby will get into the meat of the presentation.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, everybody, for attending. This recording will be on our YouTube site, so please, when you receive it, share it out as well. As Brenda mentioned, we're talking about zoning and the transit potential. This work has grown out of Bryce's hard dedication to our work with the National Zoning Atlas project. And as we all know, transit is a big part of where we want to put as much housing and mixed use development as possible. The slide here on the cover shows just one aspect of a potential bus rapid transit route that our state is considering. So welcome. Next slide. So today, again, we will take that overview of transit and affordability. Zoning is big in the news, so we'll just cover that for a second. The background of how HousingWorks has been working on zoning research, and then getting into the nitty-gritty of the intersections of transit and housing, along with Bryce's analysis of the zoning around the proposed high corridor transit. Next slide. So as no one here will be surprised, Rhode Island's affordability crisis was well covered in our 2023 Housing Fact Book. These are some snapshots from there. This year, I can tell you now, the numbers are just going to be worse. So we don't want to be a state that sprawls. We do want to grow smartly. And we sincerely believe that our transit corridors represent a new way of thinking about where development could go across our state. And with that, I believe I'm going to pass this off to Toby Arment. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So as we're talking about today with housing costs and transit costs, it's important to understand household budgets. The two biggest shares of any household budget are going to be housing and transportation nationally. Those are the two biggest costs that any household's facing. And so we want to take a substantial progress at decreasing the costs facing households. The two biggest categories to hit are housing and transportation. For a healthy household budget, we consider that they shouldn't exceed 45% of the total budget. But being able to decrease the cost of moving around of transit is going to be able to decrease or allow for a budget to spend more on housing or have more for other services like entertainment, savings, childcare, whatever else it may be. And so by developing our housing in an area that is transit accessible, that is walkable, that is going to decrease the reliance on cars and allow people to find more affordable options, that is going to decrease the amount that they're spending on transit. So we can see here in Rhode Island, some of the areas where people are spending the least tend to be focused around Providence and Pawtucket, Central Falls, denser parts of the state, where people are able to take more trips by walking, by using transit, the state's bus network of RIPTA. We can see that next as a percentage of the household income. So, you know, the vast majority, any besides the light yellow categories, is places where people are spending more than 45% of their income. Those who are of 80% area median income or less are spending more than 45% of their total household income on housing and transportation, which is just too much. But you can see that the place that is most likely for that not to be the case is the area where, again, it is dense, it is walkable, and there's transit options, with Providence being overrepresented and heavily served by RIPTA. And so as we're looking forward to implementing the transit master plan, which we'll talk more about in a second, we should be looking to how can we develop areas where people are able to take fewer trips with cars, more trips with transit and walking, which will decrease the amount of money that they're needing to spend on transit total. So this work that we've been engaged with for the last year or so of doing this kind of zoning work has been hot in the news. People are talking about zoning. It is a huge constraining factor in why we cannot build as much housing around transit as we need to. You know, Practices like single-family zoning are dramatically decreasing the amount of units that we can build in an area, which decreases the feasibility of walking. It's stopped mixed use, which decreases the closeness of goods you need to get to on a daily basis. And so all around the country, especially here you can see some snapshots from New England. People are talking about zoning, on how we can analyze zoning, and doing some of the kind of work that we're doing as well. So HousingWorks began our work around the Zoning Atlas softly in 2018 when we started collecting some information about residential zoning to include in our work with the Housing Factbook. Later in 2021, we formally began collecting some zoning information for some work that we were doing with Rhode Island Housing. And in that same year, an organization called Desegregate Connecticut published a zoning atlas for the state of Connecticut, which was the first statewide zoning atlas in the nation. And that really catalyzed the process for creating the National Zoning Atlas Collaborative, which we have since joined, where we are trying to create a zoning atlas that documents the zoning processes of every municipality for every single state in the nation. In 2020, you can see here on the right some of the zoning work that we did in these earlier phases. In 2022, we began doing some zoning, GIS mapping of zoning for single families, 2-family and 3-family developments, and formally became the Rhode Island team from the National Zoning Atlas project to follow up on the work that Connecticut had done, where they were able to build an atlas of the entire state of Connecticut. And that work continued through 2022 and into 2023. We soft launched with this map of Kent County in the spring, established an advisory committee, and then through the hard work of Bryce Kelly and Chris Schutz, we were able to get enough information to fully launch our zoning atlas this last October alongside our Housing Factbook. So that is now available as a resource that people can use to see, a comprehensive map of all of the zoning in the state. And that's kind of been the catalyst for this work that we're doing now of using the zoning information that we've compiled to analyze it alongside things like transit. So here's a list of our advisory committee members. We just want to thank all of the people who help out with our work, who provide their valuable insights. These members are from a wide range of backgrounds and fields, and their expertise is endlessly valuable. So the Housing Factbook, our kind of premier publication, has been using zoning since 2019. We began collecting information to track residential development ordinances. You can see here on the right the different kinds of ordinances that we were tracking if they existed in certain communities, as these different ordinances can have a great impact on the amount of housing and the variety of housing that is able to be built in community. We also track whether they allow multifamily by right. And in 2022, the Housing Factbook included regional zoning calculations using data collected for the Rhode Island Zoning Atlas. And in 2023, we did some regional sales analyses, which you can see on the right. So this all comes together with the RIPTA's Transit Forward 2040 plan, also known as the Transit Master Plan. This was a plan adopted in 2020 to guide the system's growth for the following 20 years. It had 5 main goals that you can see here on the left: to improve existing services, to expand services to new areas, to develop high capacity transit, to improve access to transit, and to make service easier to use. In this Lunch and Learn, we're mainly focusing on the ability to develop high capacity transit and looking at some of those high capacity routes. So you can see there on the right, 2 of those routes. This is a light rail route proposed in the Transit Master Plan, and a bus rapid transit route, both of which stretch from north to south running through Providence. And our main interest in these is, if we're going to be building these routes, which are necessary, they'll be providing service to CCRI, to the airport, to Pawtucket, to 2 different commuter rail stations, then we should make sure there's the maximum amount of people possible who can utilize those services, who are going to be living near them, and who can, decrease the amount they need to spend by living near transit. So this mainly focuses on the left 2 categories, the light rail and the bus rapid transit, and the features of those, which you can read. So an important thing when developing any transit is the number of people who are able to use that transit, or how feasible it's going to be. Obviously, it's not going to make a lot of sense to build light rail through an area where nobody lives. And so this kind of matrix shows us which kinds of transit are appropriate for what level of density. And this kind of corridor that we're looking at today, where we have proposed light rail and bus rapid transit are areas that we have a high density of residents, and we can further increase that density through changes in zoning to make sure that there are a large number of residents living near, that there are a lot of jobs. There's going to be high frequency transit that people can use to get around, and are going to be able to kind of support that housing without needing space for parking a car, because they're going to be able to use transit as an alternative.
All right, appreciate it, Toby. I'm going to take over from here. So while we look at transit and its intersections with housing, it's really important to bring up the concept of smart growth and to elevate that as really guiding principles to a lot of this work. Put, simply smart growth principles support those well-planned developments directed mainly towards compact mixed-use city, town, and village centers, and preserving open space and farmland and achieving other goals. Incidentally, a lot of smart growth principles also play a very large role in our growth centers and our urban services boundaries as well, which we'll be presenting on next Wednesday during our lunch and learn. But smart growth principles promote those development types that will lead to more transportation choices, housing affordability, more efficient use of infrastructure, protection of the environment, and expansion of economic opportunity. You can see on this graphic on the right that a lot of these elements of smart growth principles really fit in nicely with the kinds of things that we're going to be talking today, right? Transportation choices, mixed land uses, compact building design, various housing options, walkable neighborhoods. So smart growth really drives a lot of this conversation that we're going to have today. So when I began analyzing a lot of the zoning around transit, it became necessary to really understand that concept of walkability. In order to make these high capacity transit routes convenient to riders as an effective mode of transportation, we really need to enable walkability to those routes, to those stops, right? It's key to making a community less car dependent. It reduces the amount of space that we need to utilize for parking. You don't need to worry about the added costs of having a car if you can walk to the places that you need to. A broader view of walkability would champion those smart growth principles that I just discussed, which would tie in that compact development, those transit options, mixed uses, and housing choices with transit. So when we decided to look at these corridors, we had to really figure out what is walkable, right? And most sources will say pretty much between a quarter mile to a half mile would be considered walkable. I said 1 and 2 laps of a track, essentially. We chose a quarter mile on a little bit more conservative end of the spectrum. And for this analysis, we took those routes and buffered out an area that was a quarter mile from those routes to really analyze zoning, not just along the routes, but along those areas that would be considered walkable. It does include some areas that, while not directly on the route itself, the buffered quarter mile walkable area extends into maybe another municipality. So I just wanted to make note of that. So quickly, before I get into the mapping element of this lunch and learn, I just want to discuss some of those intersections between transit and housing. We discussed obviously those, or a large element of that being the largest share of your household budget being housing and transit. But it's really necessary to understand that housing plays a key role in having an appropriate number of riders, right? To produce the ridership necessary for some transit routes, you need adequate, denser housing types around those transit routes, right? And the proximity to housing needs to be appropriate, right? To influence walkability, to promote that walkability. You also need mixed income housing, right? Because not everyone works the traditional 9 to 5, Monday through Friday work schedule. Mixed income housing around these transit routes allows more adoption of these transit ridership on this transit route, and justification for the different times of day and different frequency scheduling that these transit routes would offer. Mixed use development is obviously critical to the zoning around these transit routes, right? You need businesses mixed with housing. It also obviously promotes more walkability. It increases residential opportunities. It builds those jobs that you saw on a previous slide. And I think I've discussed walkability enough already, but you can see that transit is really tied to housing and making both work really effectively. So I'm going to quickly kind of just discuss a little bit about by right versus public hearing. For this analysis, we really honed in on what's allowable by right. We did that because by right is typically, you know, an easier process. It's a process for a developer, a builder. They know what to expect, right? It doesn't take a long time as long as they follow use regulations and dimensional regulations for the most part, according to zoning, they know what to expect. By right means, in a broad sense, permission to build a specific use that is allowed without a public hearing. Building a specific use is only subject to review of staff to ensure the compliance with zoning and not subject, again, to that public hearing. If a use is permitted and again follows those dimensional standards, that's when it would be considered, again, that by right use. A public hearing requirement, on the other hand, is a permission to build a specific use that is allowed only after a public hearing or review process, allowing for public comment and input, and involves more discretion and decision making than that by right use process. Again, why we're analyzing by right or a use as of right, it ensures that that developer, that builder, knows what to expect in terms of cost, timeline, scale for a project. You're more likely to see that project kind of come to fruition as proposed. And quite honestly, oftentimes with a public hearing, the scale, other elements of that project may be reduced or altered to such a degree that, you know, the project itself might have to shift dramatically in order to make itself feasible. So now I'm going to step into the actual mapping that we did. And I'm first going to explain a couple elements of these maps. The map on the left-hand side is going to show the zoning district types along that quarter-mile buffer along the high-capacity route. Those zoning district types are broken out into primary residential zoning. That's the zoning that's going to allow for residential and really nothing else. It's going to be your, in most cases, your R districts, sometimes C districts, again, that are just residential, right? The lighter blue color is going to represent zoning districts that allow for mix with residential zoning. So zoning and business or commercial. It doesn't necessarily need to be within the same structure, but as long as the zoning district allows for residential and something else, we're considering it mixed with residential zoning. And then finally, non-residential zoning, which is going to be that yellowish orange kind of color. That's going to be a district that's kind of self-explanatory. It does not allow any residential. You know, it could be an industrial district. It could be purely just a business district. It could be, you know, a highway commercial district, something like that. A couple of the other elements, so protected and undevelopable, what we considered that was, you know, any kind of water bodies, any kind of conservation or protected lands. We really tried to factor out as much of it as we could in this analysis. You know, I'm not looking specifically at soil types and suitabilities, but, you know, trying in a broad sense to understand what a municipality might be working with in terms of, you know, what could be calculated as roughly developable. So in this initial slide, we're looking at the bus rapid transit route from TF Green to Providence, ending in Central Falls via CCRI Warwick. And you can see on the left that in that zoning district type map, that quite a lot of the route is made up of primary residential. Almost half the route, I believe, is made up of primary residential zoning. which again, if we're thinking about smart growth principles, we're thinking, you know, mixed with residential, mixed use zoning is kind of that gold standard when we're considering transit. But there's also some elements of that non-residential throughout this route as well. And if you look a little bit closer, you can start to see as you cross municipal boundaries along these routes, you'll start to see shifts, pretty dramatic shifts in zoning, which if we're considering suitability along an entire corridor, entire route, that can sometimes present a challenge, right, to development. And then next to the zoning district type map for this route, we're going to look at how it's zoned specifically for different housing types. And so we can see in this BRT route from TF Green to Central Falls, there is a vast majority of it zoned for single family by right. If we're looking again at these routes and as at, you know, transit viability and housing along transit in that smart growth kind of mindset, you know, you would want to see probably more dense zoning, right, throughout the route. And that just isn't necessarily the case outside of some pockets in Providence and in Cranston, some portions and upwards through Pawtucket and Central Falls, because you can see that the zoning from single family by right to multifamily by right drops precipitously as you kind of go along that development density. And then finally on the right, when we look at the municipal share of zoning along these transit routes, you can see, you know, how it breaks down, right? So, you know, what's the share of Providence's zoning for multifamily? Well, it's 55%, right, of the multifamily along this route is within Providence, and the vast majority of those denser zoning types are contained within Providence, Pawtucket, and Central Falls, and Warwick and Cranston are quickly falling behind along these routes. If I move to the light rapid transit route, which really follows along kind of the same path, we're seeing a lot of the same trends, right? Light rail route, I should say, in that, you know, there is a lot of primary residential zoning, and of that zoning and even some of the mixed use zoning, it really favors single family housing rather than those denser housing types that are really needed along these routes. And again, you'll see the same trends of a lot of the residential zoning being absorbed by your Providences, your Pawtuckets, your Central Falls municipalities, and some of the other municipalities really just not having that ability to absorb that kind of density according to their zoning along these routes. And so we looked previously at the high capacity transit routes that kind of funneled through CCRI Warwick. Now we're going to be looking at the BRT routes that go up Eddy Street. And these are relatively similar, right, in terms of not only how they're zoned, but the breakout. Again, these trends are prevalent across Rhode Island, but especially prevalent rather through these municipalities that the high capacity transit crosses. You know, a lot of primary residential, and again, a lot of zoning that favors specifically single family by right. And again, I should mention, this isn't to say that these municipalities don't zone for higher density. They don't allow higher density. They just don't allow it by right. They're not, you know, as permissible as the single family by right category. And again, you know, vast majority of the zoning is the vast majority of the denser zoning types is in Providence, is in Pawtucket along these transit routes, which, you know, I should mention again too, that along these routes, this is just the zoning, there is housing, there is denser housing types that might pre-exist zoning, right, predate zoning entirely. And so it's really important to start to understand, again, you know, not only how it's zoned, but what actually exists along these corridors too, in terms of, you know, existing density, to really get a feel for what these routes could offer in terms of ridership and housing availability and opportunity. And then finally, this is the same route as the previous slide, but just kind of condensed along Eddy Street and ending in Providence. We get a little bit closer look at Providence's zoning specifically, and that variation in zoning between Warwick through Cranston and up to Providence. It's really stark looking at the differences in how zoning is really managed through these three municipalities along this corridor. You know, we have a lot of the mixed use zoning again in Providence, and a lot of the higher density zoning again in Providence, which isn't entirely surprising, but I think it just points, and all these slides really, all these maps really point to kind of a glaring need, right, to look at not just an entire municipality, but these directed areas where there's a lot of opportunity, right? A lot of opportunity to grow, to direct our attention and our development towards, to kind of get the biggest bang for our buck. And so, you know, I think Cranston and Warwick together represent areas of high opportunity that might not have the by right zoning now, that really fit, you know, what this route could really be. So I think it's an interesting analysis overall, and you know, the numbers tell a story, the maps tell a story, but I think that missing link for all of these analyses is the existing density and understanding how zoning interacts with existing density, to really get an idea of specifically what could be built where, and what currently is built where. So the takeaways, as I see them from this analysis, and I've mentioned them probably more than a few times already, is that there's just not enough zoning along these routes for higher density. Much of the zoning around these proposed routes don't allow for housing density that would produce that sustainable high number of ridership, high number of riders. Most of the density around these routes would incentivize the adoption of public transit, or more density through zoning would incentivize the adoption of public transit over car dependence. If all of the zoning is for single family homes with 2 parking spots per home, people are probably going to continue to drive, right? There's just not enough mixed use zoning. So the combination of primary residential zoning, allowing for mostly single family homes, and the amount of non-residential zoning really limits that ability to create those vibrant, walkable, and economically thriving communities that really these transit routes really offer a lot of opportunity to do just that, create those types of communities. And then the extreme shifts between municipalities and how zoning is treated offers an issue or a potential problem. Zoning, both in the type of district and the uses allowed, change dramatically when you cross those municipal boundaries. And I think when you look at cross municipal kind of collaboration, it makes a lot of sense to focus in on collaboration through these cohesive corridors, or towards creating more cohesive corridors. And these corridors, even without specifically focusing on proposed high capacity transit, these corridors are long-standing corridors throughout our state that offer a lot of opportunity for municipalities to work together to create, more cohesive zoning and land use policies that would further allow better use of land and better creation of higher density housing types. And so
Thank
that's
you,
all.
Bryce.
Yep.
Sorry about
Yep.
that.
Nope.
Couldn't get myself off mute. You'd think I would know by now. I'm not sure if the chat function is functioning, or questions. If there are any, I can't see them, but if there are any comments or questions from anybody who's watching us, feel free to add them into the chat if you'd like. Any other additional comments or feedback from the HousingWorks team?
You got anything?
I was just going to say, we do have some bills up at the State House right now. They don't specifically talk about transit corridors, but they do talk about commercial areas as well as adaptive reuse. And these are the kinds of functions that many of the buildings along these corridors have. So I think it's an opportunity to think about both of these things at the same time. We do have a small TOD pilot program. Hopefully, if RIPTA can remain a healthy, functioning organization, we can grow that program and maybe actually put some of this analysis to use. So thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Bryce.
Yeah, no, thank you for those observations. To me, this is a very natural connection, as well as the HousingWorks team knows my father was director of transportation at RIPTA for many, many years. Before he retired, he's retired a long time ago. But so riding the RIPTA bus and making sure there was a robust transit system was something that was near and dear to his heart. And so, and to me, it's an obvious connection to housing and housing development as well. So, just want to, hearing or seeing no questions, I just want to do a plug for our next session on growth centers on April 24th, if I have the date correctly. We'll also be doing a similar format on Zoom and taping the presentation, but please feel free to share that invitation out with any colleagues that are interested in. As Annette mentioned, we'll be posting this on the HousingWorks YouTube and sending it out through social media. And Zach's joined from RIPTA. Thank you, Zach, for joining us and for the feedback that we've received from both you and Sarah on this project as well, and others at RIPTA. I don't know if I think because we're in webinar form, I don't think you guys can talk, unfortunately. But if you have a comment or question, Zach, that you want to add into the chat, please feel free to do that. As I said, we're helping. Sorry, go ahead, Bryce.
Oh, no, I was just going to add, and I failed to mention this earlier, is that this analysis really didn't even take into account, those dimensional regulations of zoning that can make development even tougher, right? I'm only looking at, the zoning district itself and the use of that zoning district. I'm not even talking about, those areas that require 10,000 square feet for a single family home or 20,000 square feet. So there's a lot more opportunity within this analysis to dive deeper and to identify, it's not just about having more mixed use zoning and having more zoning that allows for multifamily development within a walkable distance from these transit routes. It's about making it work in a way that you can actually achieve that density, right? If you still require 20,000 square feet for a 3-family home or something, in this area, it's still not going to produce the number of riders that might be necessary, right?
Yeah, and and I think the other important point of all of this, and I'm fairly confident I'm preaching to the choir on this, is that not only does this help us get to our housing and transit goals, but also gets to our climate or our sustainability goals, right? And our trying to look at carbon emissions, trying to look at all of the things that we know that we need to be paying attention to as we continue to grow and develop and address what we're already seeing in terms of weather patterns changing and climate change. So, the good news about this is that we think that this tool is really helpful for these conversations that we know many communities are very interested in having and are already starting to have about how do we better plan for the future. So again, a plug for the next session on growth centers. And we will also be talking about all of this stuff at the Smart Growth Conference. I don't have the name of the summit correct, but on May 3rd.
Power of Place Summit.
The Power of Place Summit, thank you. On May 3rd, which I hope a number of you will be able to attend as well too. And we look forward to continuing to work to make our communities more affordable but healthier, and where people have access to all of the services that they need. And transportation is a key part of that conversation. Thanks,
and-
everyone. Thank you for taking the time. And again, be on the lookout for the link for you to share with your colleagues.
And I'll
Thank-
just add that if you want to explore the Rhode Island Zoning Atlas, it's available on our website under the Learning Center. It's also available on the National Zoning Atlas's website now. They have stood up kind of a parallel map that has the same kind of usability and features across the entire nation, so you can do more state to state analysis and not kind of municipal to municipal analysis. And then I just add that, you know, I know I kind of flew through some of these maps a little quickly today, but I intend on, you know, saving each transit scenario as its own slide, and we can maybe upload that to our website so people can spend a little bit more time actually looking along those routes. Right now in our Rhode Island Zoning Atlas, we don't have necessarily these buffered areas around these transit routes as layers within our map. So you could obviously follow, if you know where the route is, follow it and kind of do the same kind of analysis. But maybe in the near future, we can kind of add those buffered areas so you can really hone in and look at specific corridors, right?
Okay. Sounds good. So for all of you geeky people like us who want to dive in deep, we'll be providing you all of the tools to do that. So thanks again to HousingWorks team and all of our the advisory board members for this project. We very much appreciate your input. Thanks for your time, and we'll be talking more. Thanks. Bye, everyone. Thanks,
I
everyone.
need to stop recording.